So I've spoken a fair few times in my videos about villains who are sympathetic, humanised, and in some cases redeemable. It's a trope I do enjoy, and one that I like to see written well, given just how easy it is to get wrong. However, today I figured maybe it's time to look at the exact opposite side of the coin. That being, villains who are so unsympathetic and so unredeemable that they have the audiences on the edge of their seats waiting for their demise. Like, it's easy to write a villain who's simply just a bad guy. Someone who provides a decent enough obstacle to the point where, while you are cheering for them to lose and the hero to win, they don't bring forth any kind of visceral hatred from their audiences. And while it does take talent to make a villain sympathetic in spite of their villainy, it also takes talent to make a villain that's so detestable that every moment they're on screen, they have the audience seething. So what is it that makes such a villain so hateable? How does one go about writing an antagonist that the audience actively despises? I've spoken a lot of negative words about Game of Thrones in the past, and at this point I'm absolutely not alone in that. And you know what? It's kind of a shame, because before its terrible ending, Game of Thrones was honestly one of the most influential shows out there, and has given us a lot of fantastic content. And if there's one thing it absolutely did manage to get right, it's that it gave us one of the most hateable villains in modern media. A villain that I feel makes a perfect case study for just how to turn an antagonist into a complete hate sink. That villain being Joffrey Baratheon. While Game of Thrones has always been a show with dense and complicated plots, during the early seasons, Joffrey was pretty much the closest thing the show had to a main antagonist. His early role in the show introduced him as the Crown Prince of Westeros, and son of King Robert Baratheon, except it turns out he's not actually his son, as his real father is Jaime Lannister. When the Lannisters manage to get Robert killed, Joffrey becomes king and proceeds to become a despicable tyrant, first having Ned Stark executed, then plunging the Seven Kingdoms into war, starting riots in the capital, tormenting Sansa Stark, having literal babies killed, and other various atrocities until his eventual death courtesy of best grandma Olenna Tyrell. So having said all that, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out just why Joffrey is hated, right? Well, yes and no. As in, these abhorrent actions certainly do contribute to it, but it's not the only deciding factor, and we'll get to that later. Generally, when trying to get a character across as an out-and-out villain rather than just an antagonist, you need them to cross a line that should not be crossed. That line has become colloquially known as the moral event horizon, referring to an action so heinous that it renders a villain unforgivably bad. In Joffrey's case, while he had done some pretty terrible things beforehand, like threatening Arya's friend and getting Sansa's direwolf killed, the moment Joffrey truly crosses the point of no return is of course executing Ned Stark, despite teasing the notion that he would allow him to simply join the Night's Watch, starting a war with the North in the process. What makes this action truly heinous is not just that he's killing a man as honourable as Ned Stark, nor the fact that it has terrible consequences. It's the fact that he doesn't need to do it, but chooses to do it anyway, despite knowing the consequences it can and will bring. While this show has often looked into the morality of taking a person's life and the consequences it can bring, this is a very clear-cut case of a killing that is done purely out of spite and without any real justification, and thus Joffrey establishes himself as a major villain of the series. And while he certainly lives up to this reputation through his atrocities, this isn't what entirely makes him as hateable as he is. After all, many villains do cross the moral event horizon without necessarily being hated. Many aspiring writers may make the mistake of assuming that a villain's actions are entirely what makes them more hateable, but that isn't entirely the case. So, is it down to having a horrible personality then? Well, in order to answer that question, let's look at who Joffrey is as a character. His first appearances show that while he tries to put on a facade of being a charming prince, deep down he is incredibly selfish and entitled. It makes perfect sense given he's been raised by Cersei Lannister, a member of one of the most powerful families in Westeros, who dotes upon her 3 children to an obsessive degree, and has effectively raised him to be just like her in the worst ways possible, as in cruel, selfish, spiteful, entitled, and overall terrible at playing the political game without any self-awareness of this fact. As the series goes on and Joffrey becomes more powerful, his spoilt, bratty nature turns into tyranny, as becoming king is enough to convince him that he can do whatever he wants without consequences, and, in his own words, everyone is his to torment. If he wants to torture his betrothed, he'll do it. If he wants to have a random peasant beheaded for throwing a cow pie at him, he'll do it. If he wants to slaughter every one of King Robert's illegitimate children, he'll do it. And half the time, he doesn't even seem to enjoy his terrible actions a great deal. He simply does them to prove that he can, and to smugly rub it in the faces of people he doesn't like. What's interesting about Joffrey as a character is that he isn't driven by a lust for power, given he already has everything he could ever want. He's driven purely by selfishness and spitefulness, because he's effectively grown up to believe that the world revolves around him, and if people don't behave in the exact way he wants, then in his mind, they need to be punished for not pleasing him. When it gets down to it, Joffrey is effectively the equivalent to a spoilt rich bully who got to take over his daddy's business despite not being at all qualified for it. And therein lies the true reason for Joffrey's hateability. It's not just that he's a terrible person who does terrible things, it's the sheer relatability of the situation. Joffrey is not merely a bad person in the context of the story, he's the type of terrible person that you can imagine meeting in real life. This is ultimately what separates the truly despisable villains from the merely intolerable villains. While their actions being unforgivable is important, and their personality being awful certainly does help, the key ingredient of making a detestable villain is making them a mirror image of people your audience are likely to have met and hated in real life. A lot of classic evil overlord style villains, no matter how well written they might be, are probably not the kind of people you would have been likely to meet in real life. Like, sure, we will happily root against a character like Voldemort from the Harry Potter series, but most of us probably can't relate to fighting an evil, racist, over-the-top snake man literally incapable of feeling love for others. But when you take away all of the fantastical historical elements of Joffrey, well, like I say, what you have is basically a spoilt rich brat, raised by an equally cruel and entitled rich mother, whose sheer selfishness has led him to become a bully who does what he wants because he knows he can get away with it. Let's be honest, most people in the audience will have likely met a person like that before. Someone who thinks that the world revolves around them, someone who will go out of their way to punish anyone who doesn't kiss their feet, then will act smug about it. When the audience boo Joffrey, they aren't just booing the character, they're booing every Joffrey that they've ever come across in their life. From the smug rich high school bully, to the horrible selfish co-worker who gets promoted thanks to nepotism despite being unqualified, and generally any narcissistic brat that they've ever had the misfortune to be around. If anyone out there is an aspiring writer, then take this lesson to heart. If you are trying to write a villain as hateable as Joffrey Baratheon, then the best place to take inspiration from isn't necessarily from, say, the most evil historical figures of all time, nor even the most dastardly fictional evil overlords. Instead, think about the worst people you've ever met in your life, and figure out exactly what it was that made you hate them. When it comes to fiction, the stories that strike a chord best with their audiences are always those that are relatable. And at the end of the day, what could be more relatable than wanting to see a spoilt rich bratty bully get repeatedly slapped in the face? Thanks for watching the video. As I said, since I've been pretty critical of Game of Thrones ever since the series finale, it is nice to get a reminder of why the show was so good to begin with. And speaking of praise, I just want to give serious credit to actor Jack Gleeson for his amazing performance as Joffrey. Like, it takes talent to write such a hateable character, but it takes talent and guts to portray such a hateable character, since it's your face that'll be forever associated with said character, and, well, certain parts of fandom have serious issues when it comes to separating characters from their actors. Anyways, as always, like, share and subscribe, and donate to me on Patreon if you can, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye.